It's violent individuals, lone wolf radicals, as you said. It's organizations that promote violence, plan violence, execute violence, and it's mobs. All of these are distinct because a very well-adjusted individual who has no tolerance for political violence can nevertheless be consumed by a mob, and then the lizard brain, this reptilian element, takes over and compels the well-adjusted even to engage in violent activities along with the crowd.
And welcome back to The Narrative. Aaron Baer, David Mahan with you today, and with our special guest, Noah Rothman from National Review. He's a senior writer over there, the foremost journal of conservative scholarly opinion and analysis in America since its founding in 1955. He is the author of Unjust: Social Justice and the Unmaking of America, and the Rise of the New Puritans Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Mr. Rothman graduated from Drew University with a degree in Russian Studies and Political Science, and he earned a graduate degree from Seton Hall University on diplomacy and international relations. He's also the author of a new book, Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America. Noah Rothman, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Noah, I mean, there's so many aspects of this book that I feel like are obvious for this first question, but I do want to start us here. Especially as you're talking to an organization that is on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. But why this book, why this topic, and why now?
Well, the Southern Poverty Law Center actually plays a role in this book. It's one of the primary organizations that is creating sort of a permission structure, buttressing with superficial evidence the claim that the American left, violence on the American left, rather, is a quote-unquote myth. That was the Southern Poverty Law Center's position. And it contrasts with the American right, which is preternaturally violent. The right is the primary threat to American civic comity and security. And you hear that all the time. In fact, you hear it a lot more because there are consistently episodes of left-wing violence now that have to have this rote rejoinder attached to them. Well, don't worry too much about it because it's the right that's violent. A shooting at an ICE facility or a CBP facility and a successful or attempted assassination of a right-wing political figure, up to and including the president, not once, not twice, but thrice. The mobs that descend almost nightly on America's major urban centers and target law enforcement with violence in the process. And then we have to hear, it's the right. It's the American right. That reflex is what Blood and Progress is about. It looks at the last 125 years or so of American history and finds some really similar features of episodes of left-wing violence, waves of left-wing violence in previous decades, the 1910s, the 1920s, 1970s, the 1980s, the 2010s, the 2020s. We're in one now. And the history of it is not very well studied. I would argue it is not an obscure history, but a suppressed history. It is suppressed through very dubious, misclassified or misapplied data sets, some of which the SPLC themselves promote, through an academic culture that regards the study of left-wing extremism as basically an invalid activity. There was a document that I write about in the first chapter of the book, prepared for the Department of Homeland Security in 2021 by the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center. It's called NSITE. And the document maintains that the study of anarchistic and left-wing political violence is a third rail, that individuals who engage in that practice will face social ostracization, reputational damage, even the threat of physical retribution for doing their work, to say nothing of the fact that the study of left-wing violence is very frequently conducted, according to this document, by people who are active members of the organizations they are studying. It is a very fraught and hopelessly subjective enterprise. And once you start digging into these individual acts of left-wing political violence in which the perpetrator believes through some delusion, some disordered thinking, that an act of violence will beget positive social change, then you start to see, the sort of through line through history that offers us predictive and even prescriptive elements. But it's the sort of thing that people within our society who are in command of institutions tend to look away from, in part because I think it alienates the sort of people who they want to ingratiate themselves with, the members of the activist class within their side of the political aisle, and jeopardizes their career prospects, their potential for advancement, their reputations in this parlors that they frequent. And it has become not a conspiracy, not a written down plot, but it is something of shared interests that conspire in their own way to shield us from a full accounting of violence in the United States committed by left-wing political activists. That's what I hope this book, Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America, popularizes and gives us permission to finally wrap our hands around this phenomenon. Because if you're only looking at one side of this equation, the American right and the radical right, which does exist, you're never going to comprehend the scale of the problem and create holistic solutions to it.
So no, I know your research goes back 100, 200 years. Are you in your book, are you focusing more on lone wolf radicalism? Are you looking at like groups? And if so, what are some of the stereotypical behaviors that you're seeing in some of these radicals, left or right?
Yeah, so it's violent individuals, lone wolf radicals, as you said. It's into organizations that promote violence, plan violence, execute violence, and it's mobs. All of these are distinct because a very well-adjusted individual who has no tolerance for political violence can nevertheless be consumed by a mob, and then the lizard brain, this reptilian element, takes over and compels the well-adjusted even to engage in violent activities along with the crowd. Those are all distinct phenomena. They exist within a continuum, but they're treated differently. I treat them differently. And sort of the similarities that you see across the century and a half or so that I explore is the degree to which, and I think that this is the reason why we have such a pronounced wave of violence. Here is the big conspiracy theory that is very popular among those who engage in left-wing political violence to achieve political ends, and that's essentially the Marxian narrative, the end of history that will be accelerated by the meting out of careful, select violence against the right targets, the right people, that will galvanize the country. One particular act of violence demonstrates that and will beget a sort of mass reaction to the oppressive conditions with which we are all surrounded, but refuse to recognize or simply cannot recognize, or if we do recognize, do not have permission to work to act against. This is the Marxian narrative. It is what animated the socialistic and communistic terrorist organizations of the 1910s and 1920s, which acted self-described anarchists, so they were, acted violently against police, law enforcement, and government officials in order to bring about, in their own words, the proletarian revolution. Same thing that we saw with the Marxist guerrilla movements of the 1970s and 1980s, which were beholden to Cuban-style Foucaultism, and the notion being that a small insurgent organization can collapse a society from within. And lastly, to our own time, in which those same narratives are increasingly prevalent as the collective immunity that the country had to Marxism and the appeal of the Marxian narrative begins to wane with the increasingly distant memory of the Cold War. So yeah, I think all of those contribute, and most of them have in their roots some attraction to the Marxian narrative, which, by the way, includes Islamist terrorism. The Iranian regime incorporated a ton of Marxist elements into it. There is today in Iran, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, a cult around Che Guevara, a cult around that kind of Brazilian theorist Marghella and his urban theories of urban warfare, guerrilla warfare, and the Marxian terrorist movements of the 1970s, as demonstrated both by me and by Jason Burke in his new book, The Revolutionists, evolved from pro-Cuban insurgents to pan-Arab nationalists gravitating to the kind of socialist pan-Arab nationalism that was advocated by the Iraqi regime and the Syrian regime when they were Ba'athist, into straight up Islamist radicals after the Islamic revolutionary movement. And the through line isn't ideology, really. The ideology kind of shifts, even though it's always collectivist. The through line is violence. The through line is the attachment to the revolutionary zeal, the romance of violent action in pursuit of meliorist, utopian political objectives. That is what we see throughout history, and we see it today. And by failing to study it, we don't get to anticipate what's coming, and we have no immunity to what happened before, and therefore no resistance to it when it comes for us again.
So no, that was, I think, for me in this most recent, we have to be very specific when we're referring to President Trump assassination attempts. Um, but with the most recent one, what was most chilling about it, obviously anybody who is trying to assassinate someone or just kill anyone generally isn't well adjusted necessarily, but the the manifesto this guy wrote, um, read very clear-eyed. It wasn't a crazy ranting like you're reading about these two folks who just tried to do a mass shooting at the mosque, and their rantings are a pretty similar kind of crazy, out there, all over the map. I hate everybody. Everyone should die. Whatever. This guy was read like a random post on X or Blue Sky or whatever. He was much more clear-eyed. Can you talk about, well, one, what was your perception of the teacher that tried to assassinate President Trump at the Hilton?
Yeah.
And is this what you're talking about, of sort of that Marxist worldview in action on what we're seeing in assassination attempts today?
Well, so I took no comfort from your observation, which I also shared, that this is the sort of thing that you could read on your average thread on Blue Sky.
Yeah.
I think that's why Nora O'Donnell, CBS News anchor, confronted the president himself. What's your reaction to the fact that this deranged lunatic who tried to kill you called you a pedophile, rapist, and traitor? Um, in an earlier age, the acts of the assassin would retroactively invalidate his deranged ramblings. Not today.
Mhm.
Why? Maybe because Nora O'Donnell encounters those narratives herself on almost a daily basis, if not more, when she peruses Blue Sky. Because this is the sort of thing, there was a time in living memory when Democrats were really consumed with fear over the promulgation of mis and disinformation. Not anymore.
Yeah.
All those notions being that he's a pedophile, a traitor, a criminal, a rapist, all of them sort of being derived from facts that are not in evidence, but have been elaborated on based on a half understanding of the trial of the president, for example, in the E. Jean Carroll situation, the Robert Mueller probe into the Russia collusion stuff. They don't understand, they don't know, or if they do know, they don't care how those were resolved. And they weren't resolved in the way that President Trump's assassins thinks they were, or Nora O'Donnell thinks perhaps the president should answer for, because she's not satisfied with how the proceedings ended up. But they're nevertheless a conspiracy theory. They're paranoid at the very least. And that goes back to Marxism, doesn't it? Which is the conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory. The notion being that there's some special influence enjoyed by rapacious capitalists and the capital that they wield, omniscient, ill-defined, unseen, yet all-powerful forces that have robbed you of that which is your due in life and are the problem of all society, and the extirpation of them would deliver us to the sunlit uplands, the end of history. This is the central conspiracy theory that I think animates Marxian elements that are inspired by, indeed moved to, violence. And the fact that it is common doesn't give me any comfort. It's more or less cold comfort. The fact that it is so common is more or less terrifying to me. But it is a series of myths to which they are beholden. And the fact that it generates a violent response from maladjusted, deluded thinking individuals, granted. But somebody who's delusional and acts out violently can have as big an impact on history as a clear-eyed ideologue. So these are distinctions that I think merit very, very little dwelling on, to the degree that they matter at all.
In your bio, diplomacy, international relations, is part of what you study. I know we talked a little bit, Iran came up already in the conversation today. Right now, I don't think I'm alone in this, but so many folks are wondering about the negotiations that are going on between the United States and Iran. And, right now it's an economic battle. where, we're kind of hoping for an uprising there so that people of Iran can just take care of the situation for this regime on their own. Is there ever a time where an uprising or a revolt would be justified?
Oh, most certainly. It's in the Iranian context, it's hard to say where it wouldn't be justified. I mean, in this is a nation that has within its founding documents, its central political philosophy, the notion that it is a revolutionary government. It has no brook for the people's will. The people are indeed the foremost obstacle before this nation. It has sacrificed all its legitimacy by executing perhaps 30,000 or more
Right, his own
citizens who were
people.
merely seeking redress for legitimate grievances for their government. There's a lot of people who try to make equations between totalitarian, which the Iranian regime is, and authoritarian, which are different things, but the Iranian regime is both totalitarian and authoritarian. And they try to equate that with the United States, as though the United States doesn't have conflict resolution mechanisms baked into its founding charter. And that is one of the foundational elements of legitimacy of a political system, that there are legitimate mechanisms for conflict resolution, either with your neighbors or your government, that are independent of the people in power, the ideology that happens to have political power at any given moment. To say nothing of the fact that the American people have input on their government every 2 to 4 years, depending on the chamber that you're talking about. So that to me, they seem, considerations that are just, we're confusing categories here. But the Iranian regime deserves to be revolted against. The Soviet Union deserved to collapse. The Tiananmen Square massacre was a legitimate political movement that was put down violently. There's nothing you can say in the American context that amounts to that, because where we have conflict, where we have even mass conflict between the state and protesters, for example, or people who are seeking redress, we ourselves get to adjudicate that. The people and the people's instruments of conflict resolution, e.g., the courts, e.g., legislatures, we all have input on that, and we all can resolve to meet in our own little way, smaller scale, reconciliation, truth and reconciliation programs, right? The notion being that we adjudicate these conflicts and there's no opacity behind it. It's all transparent, and we're all working towards mediation and resolution. So I don't see the parallels there, but in a theoretical way, I can absolutely sign on board to the notion that there are illegitimate regimes that deserve to be confronted by their people and indeed dismantled by their people.
So Noah Rothman is with us, National Review author, but also author of a new book, Blood and Progress: A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America. Noah, and the book just came out this week, so normally I like to at least skim the book before we bring you on, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But as we were getting from your guys' end some notes on the book, one of the chapters is Heroes and Martyrs, and you kind of go through in that chapter various leaders or influential people throughout history, especially modern history, that have sort of built the worldview of left-wing violence. Who are some of the folks that have shaped the modern left's thinking more than we might realize? Right. So maybe some folks that most folks have never heard of, but have such a profound influence on the thinking in America's left today.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They may not have any knowledge or memory of these people, but when it comes to the Heroes and Martyrs chapter, I kind of doubt it, because some of these names are just front and center in the pantheon of heroes, or indeed individuals who were singled out for, in the minds of the far left activist class, persecution by the state, who were absolutely 100% guilty and were 100% violent and were just generally criminal.
Yeah.
Free Mumia was one. That was a slogan that was all but ubiquitous in the 1990s, Mumia Abu Jamal. And it would be the endeavor of a lifetime to find out exactly what happened to him in that trial if you were to search the name Mumia Abu Jamal. If you search out the name Daniel Foster, who was the Philadelphia police officer who he shot and killed, the whole thing becomes much clearer. In fact, the fact pattern that was established in Philadelphia's courts and adjudicated subsequently by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court not once but twice and have been upheld, is rather clear cut. The facts and evidence are clear. What isn't clear is the degree to which the activist class muddies the water, because it's not as though the activists say, had said, the sort of star has faded there, said that he was not guilty of his crimes. It was because of a dozen facts or a dozen and a half facts or 24 facts. It's never one central fact like the chain of evidence was broken, which is what actually gets somebody off in a criminal trial. It was everything and everything, to say nothing of the fact that this guy made a sort of tendentious claim to have some affiliation with the Black Liberation Army, or the Black Panthers, rather. And that, by virtue of that association, which he retroactively claimed for himself, that mobilized the revolutionary left to rally to his side, and rally they did. There were concerts in his name. There were Million Man marches in his name in the 1990s. Again, the star has faded, but it was a cult around him that gave permission to those who styled themselves revolutionary activists, which this individual did, again retroactively in prison, gives them license to lash out. Similarly, Joe Biden pardoned Leonard Peltier, who had become a Native American activist, all but wreathed in laurels, given a halo and wings by the activist class for the contention that his prosecution was hopelessly marred. And the prosecution had its problems, as a Canadian court that subsequently upheld it when they extradited him maintained. Nevertheless, the allegations against him that he had participated in and engaged in with his colleagues, the murder of 2 federal agents on an Indian reservation, that was beyond dispute. It is only beyond dispute among the activist class, who wants to see him as an avatar of their movement and not a regular rank and file criminal. The worst offender in this ranks is probably Assata Shakur, Joanne Chesimard, who is a radical with the Black Liberation Army, and who was convicted of participation in the murder of a state trooper on the side of a New Jersey highway, and then subsequently broke out of prison and spent the rest of her life living rather comfortably, by all accounts, in communist Cuba, a fugitive from American justice. There are places on American campuses that are named after her. There are journals that are devoted to her. The Women's March, which was a sort of mainstream democratic organization before its leadership fell apart amid anti-Semitism scandals, celebrated her as a revolutionary hero, and celebrated the degree to which her actions helped bring us one day closer to the revolution, in which we'll all get our comeuppance. There's no reckoning with the extent to which the even mainstream Democratic left has canonized, beatified these personalities who are, if not just rank criminals, certainly guilty of normalizing violence and practicing violence in pursuit of political objectives, which is very important when we're talking about political violence, left-wing, terroristic political violence designed to terrorize and thereby beget social outcomes. And that's something that I hope readers of Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America, will confront upon reading it.
So, looking at, say the early 1900s, the degree of activism and violence that you see back then versus what we're seeing today, are there any characteristics, some markers that, while we're watching the news, while we're hearing the rhetoric of left and right, are there some things some through lines that we can pick up on to say, hey, this is what Noah's talking about?
Yeah, and I'll just say, because I was having the same thought there, Noah, especially compared to the 60s, right? Because I think every time people would say to me, like, oh, we're as divided in America as we've ever been, I would always be like, well, listen, in the 60s, we were shooting people, right? We were shooting political leaders. Well, that's kind of happening again. So what do you see as the connection between these two, between both left-wing violence in the early 1900s, but also in the 60s as well, to today?
So the scale of the violence in our time, as compared with the 1960s and 1970s, and even the anarchist wave of the 10s and 20s, is hopeful, because it's less. We don't have anywhere near the scale of the violence that we had at the time. Indeed, in a world in which 9/11 never happened, we'd probably be experiencing a lot more bombings because it's much harder to get your hands on explosive material than it was before 9/11, and the bomb is the instrument of the left-wing terrorist campaign throughout the couple of the last century and a half or so. Although bombings have not stopped in the Chaz, for example, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in the 2020 during the riots in Seattle, there was a bombing of a police station, which was very indicative of the sort of violence that we saw in the 1910s, 1920s. As far as through lines go, there is a sense among those who orchestrate revolutionary violence, and the design is revolutionary violence in their minds, that they are afflicting the comfortable, that they are engineering a reversal of social roles, bringing low those who enjoy undue benefits from their station in life. That's one iteration of the violent and radicalized. We can see in their targeting something that is perhaps a leading indicator of more violent waves. The burning of courthouses and businesses, attacks on police in particular. This is something that I find especially unnerving because the anarchist violence of the 1910s and the terroristic campaigns of the Marxist guerrilla movements in the 70s all made a fetish of killing police officers. And we've begun to see that in the last year or so, perhaps a little bit more. The attacks on ICE and CBP facilities last year were especially unnerving because they were designed to murder federal law enforcement officers. And indeed, one attack in Texas featured really sophisticated ambush tactics. It was about 10 people who used fireworks to lure their targets out of their buildings, at which point they opened up on them from overlapping fields of fire. It was the sort of thing that was very redolent of small cell domestic terrorism of the sort that we have not seen in this country since the 1980s. And it's back. And the degree to which we are not reckoning with it is something that I find especially unnerving. But we wouldn't reckon with it if you didn't know this history. These very recent, by recent I mean the last 10 years or so, efforts by scholars to excavate these periods of history, they all describe them as forgotten. The anarchist terrorist movement, forgotten. The nationalist movement, Puerto Rican nationalists who shot up Congress, who tried to assassinate Harry Truman, forgotten. The Marxist terrorist waves, forgotten by their own chroniclers. And is that forgetting natural, or is it abetted? Is this history obscure, or is it suppressed? This is the question that I ask in Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America, and I hope you ask it upon reading it.
So the degree of violence between left and right wing is definitely not the same. What would be some of the right wing counterparts that we're seeing some of those characteristics you just mentioned? Who would be some of those counterparts
Or what,
on
rather?
on the right? Yeah.
Yeah, because this book is about the left, and the story about the right has been told and told again. So this is not a book about the right, but it does not ignore the right, nor does it pretend that right-wing violence does not exist. That would be a child's argument, which is why it's probably so prevalent on social media. But one of my points when I devote my final chapter to the American right and the extent to which its violence is beginning to mirror the left is to hold up this mirror and force my readers to confront a rather unlovely reflection of what the left has become, or right is becoming. Just as anarchist violent extremists sort of captures most but not all of left-wing violence, domestic political violence in this country, racial and ethnic violence tends to capture most but not all right-wing violence in this country, as well as militia and sovereign citizen movement violence. That's the sort of stuff that we're familiar with in this country. Abortion bombings, Waco, Oklahoma City, and in our own time, the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer by so-called self-identified Boogaloo boys. That's very familiar. That looks like militia violence. It looks like sovereign citizen violence. What's different is the extent to which the right has begun to adopt and embrace left-wing, violent left-wing traits and tendencies. Remember that heroes and martyrs conversation we were just having? The activist right has developed a martyrology around Ashley Babbitt, who on camera was attempting to access a secure area of the Capitol, was warned repeatedly, and broke through a window and squeezed her body through before she was shot on. She's not a victim. but they've begun to invert the role of victim and victimizer, which is another thing that the excessively empathetic left has done. The degree to which they see in victims um, the agents of systemic oppression, and in victimizers, those who are rebelling against their systemic oppression. We've seen them embrace false flag narratives. The January 6th riot was supposedly a fomented and false event designed by their adversaries to humiliate the movement. The pardons of the January 6ers too, and Joe Biden pardoned whole categories of individuals, which is the problem right at the beginning. Seeing people not as individuals responsible for discrete actions, but as avatars of their class or tribe. In those pardons, Joe Biden attempted to pardon nonviolent offenders. In so doing, he pardoned a lot of very violent people whose nonviolent offense was scrubbed only as a result of plea deals, respectively, because we didn't look at them as individuals. When Donald Trump pardoned a lot of January 6ers, he pardoned a lot of violent people who were convicted of violent offenses because he didn't see them as people, individuals with agency. He saw them as avatars of a tribe. And lastly, mob tactics, affinity groups, as we saw in Charlottesville, shock forces, which is a black bloc tactic. These are the sort of things that were exclusive to the left not long ago. No longer. Now we have this undifferentiated mass of increasingly violent people whose ideologies are distinct, but their methods, their tactics are very similar, and unnervingly so.
No, I want to go back to something you were talking about a little bit ago, especially when we're talking about things like Minnesota, because I remember, and I'm blanking on the woman's name who, got into it, got
Good, Renee Good.
ran her car into an ICE agent, or and then was eventually shot and killed by ICE.
Yeah, Renee Good.
Yeah, Renee Good. That's who it was. I remember seeing that, and if I remember the details of that, she was a mom, an activist type, and my frustration when I heard that was with what we see here, especially in Ohio, as what I often will just speak in broad terms as the George Soros outrage machine, right? Like, as we organize protests at CCV all the time. It's not easy to organize protests, right? Like when we organize the Ohio March for Life here, right? And we get 3,000 to 4,000 people to show up. It takes us all year to plan that, to let everyone know, hey, this is the time, this is the place. We got to reserve all this kind of stuff. The left can they can flip a switch and get hundreds of people to show up at something in a heartbeat. I remember when Mike DeWine had allowed for President Trump to send ICE agents into some part of the state, or had invited them on. It was a very obscure policy. Most folks didn't even know what it was about. And that weekend, there were 500 protesters at the State House. How does the left organize today? How are you seeing the left organize these mass protests? I every time when I saw the Renee Good video, I'm like, what was it that inspired some suburban mom, from all I can tell, to put her car in that situation in the first place, right? To be in a place where if I see a bunch of ICE agents or a bunch of, I don't care, federal well-armed agents anyway, my last thought is, let me drive my car into that space. What is it that the left is doing to inspire what seems like our neighbors, normal folks, to put themselves in very precarious and silly situations to be in the first place?
Yeah, well, that individual and her fate was horrible, and
Right.
not deserved, but inevitable by virtue of her actions. She seemed to be beholden to two really incompatible things, or ideas. One being that federal law enforcement, ICE in particular, is unusually violent, unusually predatory, especially oppressive, with a hair trigger, and needs to be curtailed and stopped as a result of direct action. And at the same time, she was in no danger. There was almost nothing that would happen to her because this is all sort of theoretical.
Yeah, it felt
those
like
two,
she's playing with fire and doesn't realize it, right? Like it was insane.
two mutually exclusive thoughts that exist in the same head. And you see that pretty frequently in the part of people who end up engaging in this sort of very dangerous, what they call direct action, what the Italian anarchists would call propaganda of the deed. But she didn't expect that to happen to her. Of course, she didn't set out for that to happen to her. But when it comes to protest movements, I can't tell you the organizational, process from the grassroots level, because it differs from organization to organization, group to group, whether they're visible or not visible. What I can tell you is that there is a particular weakness on the Democratic left, establishmentarian mainstream liberals, as well as progressives, as well as Democrats, for people power, for images of mass movements in the streets. That to them is indicative of political zeal, a sort that can be harnessed, wielded, and advanced their careers and their political objectives. And they do it all the time. They fall for these movements all the time. They did it with Occupy Wall Street. They did it with the 2020 mobs. And if you actually interview the leaders of these organizations, much less the grassroots individual rank and file members of them, they have no use for the Democratic Party. They would much rather see the whole thing, disbanded and cast off into the sea. But the Democrats themselves compartmentalize all that, see no problem embracing these organizations, feting them, lauding them, placing them within the context of historical movements in the United States that were far more salutary and far more sympathetic, like the American Civil Rights Movement. They're forever giving them justification for what they end up engaging in, which is antisocial behavior, violent behavior, and advocating, as they so often do, the dissolution of the United States, the overthrow of the American Civic Compact, and its replacement with something much more socialistic. And why are we seeing this mob, this movement of violent left-wing activism today? Because the prescriptions against Marxism have eroded. Marxian revolutionary activism, the zeal, the passion, that's what fueled the terrorism of the 10s and 20s, fueled it in the 70s and 80s, fuels it in our day. And it sort of all comes back to the notion that one galvanizing violent act will drive the people into the streets and finally give them permission to lash out against the suppressive system that they know they despise, that they know is oppressing them, but just don't have the gumption to go after it. This is the myth. And feeding into it creates the problems that we're facing now. And I hope Blood in Progress begins to open their eyes to the conditions they've allowed to metastasize.
So Noah Rothman, one final question is, as you know, we're talking a little bit about the 1960s, and I was sort of reading the summary of your book. I kept coming back to thinking about Martin Luther King, and every time you read any of MLK's writings or any history of him, central to his message was nonviolence, right? And no one could rightfully accuse Martin Luther King of being a right wing, a right wing activist or anything like that. He was certainly center left, but nonviolence was key to his method of social change. Where would Martin Luther King and his movement? Is there anybody on the left that would align with that view today? And two, how did he interact with the left-wing violence of his day that was certainly
Stokely Carmichael,
everywhere, right?
Yeah, and Malcolm X. There are many Democrats, mainstream liberals, I would dare say most, who are genuinely repulsed by political violence, who are outspoken about it. But they do hedge. They do hedge, in my view, in order to preserve their influence among the activist class, on whom they depend on their careers to some degree, but out of also intimidation. The threat environment and the threats that lawmakers and members of courts and what have you are getting now is really pronounced, and the threat environment is deteriorating so rapidly that they have to take it seriously. And as I write in the book, there's evidence that it's affecting their decision making, affecting their votes even. It's quite unnerving. But yeah, Barack Obama in 2011 said that the Occupy was branded anarchistic, just as MLK was branded an anarchist by his adversaries, creating the moral equivalency there, which I think he regretted in pretty short order. But that is where they leap to, the notion being that anything that is a leftist protest movement is a direct inheritor to the movement that was dedicated to civil disobedience. All evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, and it's time to apply some discretion. These are political narratives. It's not observational. It's not empirical. It's just designed to advance, without evidence, an aspirational political theory And that's bitten the Democratic Party far too much, and it's about time they recognize the folly of it before it comes for all of us.
So Noah Rothman of National Review, author of Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America. If folks want to dive deeper in this, get your book, where can they both find you online and then find your book?
You can find me on X at Noah C. Rothman. You can read me almost every day at National Review, nationalreview.com. And you can buy this book, Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America, wherever fine books are sold.
I appreciate it, Noah. Thanks for being here with us.